Hi guys, Sci-Fi Recapped here. Before we start, warning. Spoilers ahead. Today, I'm gonna explain a 2016 American fantasy and adventure movie called Pete's Dragon. The movie begins with a little boy called Pete, who is reading a book about a lost puppy named Elliot while on a road trip with his parents. Suddenly, a deer blocks the road and the car crashes, leaving poor Pete as the only survivor. He picks up the book in his bag and runs deep inside the woods, only to be surrounded by a pack of wolves. However, the wolves sense something, then become frightened and back away. Pete looks up to find a big green dragon, curious about him instead of going to eat him. He follows the dragon deep into the woods. 6 years later, in the small town of Millhaven, Meacham, an old man, is telling a story about how he once encountered a dragon in the woods. No one believes him as he is the only one to ever claim to see a dragon, but the story fascinates little children. His daughter, Grace, a forest ranger, is not convinced of his story either and claims that she has known the forest and ventures there a lot but has never seen any dragon. Meanwhile, in the forest, Peter is cheerfully playing with Elliot, including a hide-and-seek game that demonstrates Elliot's ability to turn invisible. He then discovers Grace, seeking owls in the woods using her compass and maps. He watches her from afar, following her to an opening where a tractor is left. Grace tosses away the tractor's key to annoy Gavin, its owner, who is an ambitious lumberjack. At night, Pete goes to his home in the woods, a cave underneath a big tree where he sleeps with Elliot. The next day, Pete watches the opening again, observing Grace arguing with Jack, Gavin's brother and also her boyfriend, that they cannot cut down trees in this area deep inside the forest. Jack's daughter, Natalie, is getting bored of waiting for his father, then ventures outside of her car. She spots a sign of Pete, gets curious, and follows him into the woods. Pete moves fast as he is used to the forest, quickly climbing a tree to get away from Natalie. She tries to climb the same tree but loses her footing and falls. Her scream attracts Jack and the woodsman, so they head to the forest and discover Pete. Grace notices that Pete wears the same compass she lost in the forest yesterday. Pete tries to escape them but Gavin accidentally knocks him unconscious. Elliot, sensing that Pete is not nearby, howls to attract his attention, but to no avail. Gavin hears Elliot's howl and becomes curious about the sound, so he decides to go hunting. Pete is taken to a hospital and hallucinates going camping with his late mother. The doctors report his good vital condition to Grace, who also takes care of Natalie. Natalie wanders into Pete's room only to find him missing, already escaping through the window. Although the police search for him, he manages to outrun them, jumping on top of a school bus until he is cornered at a high fence. Grace catches him and tries to calm him down, but he attempts to escape again and creates a loud howling sound, which worries her. However, she talks to the sheriff to convince him to not bring Pete to the hospital again but takes him to Jack and Natalie's house instead. Arriving there, Pete tries to escape again into the woods, but Grace catches him again. Pete tells her about Elliot, his friend in the woods, but when she asks for more details, Jack interrupts to bring them in. Pete is mesmerized by the technology and details of Natalie's house, while she patiently explains each thing to him. Meanwhile, Gavin and his men wander deep into the woods until they arrive at Pete and Elliot's treehouse. Unbeknownst to them, Elliot, in invisible mode, is following them all along. Gavin takes Pete's book out of the cave, which angers Elliot, exposing himself to the men to scare them off. Gavin attempts to shoot the dragon, only to find Elliot smashes his rifle like it is nothing. The men hastily drive off, Elliot secretly following them with the hope that he can find Pete. Back in Jack's house, Pete finds Natalie's storybook about Elliot, which is an exact copy of his. Then Grace asks if Elliot is a dog. Pete shakes his head, but then Grace is interrupted by a call from the sheriff who dug into old missing person cases. He deduces that Pete's family was in a car crash 6 years ago and the boy went missing. The social services wants to take custody of him tomorrow morning. Meanwhile, Pete is drawing Elliot using Natalie's crayons. Grace talks to Pete privately, and she is intrigued when Pete shows her his drawing of Elliot. Pete also thinks Elliot will like Grace and he is excited to introduce her to him tomorrow morning. Gavin, back from the forest, knocks on Jack's door. Jack does not believe his brother encountered a dragon and refuses to wander off to the woods so late at night. Gavin leaves while Elliot secretly lands near Jack's house. He peeks through a window to see Pete, Natalie, Grace, and Jack are sitting together, the kids listening to Jack reading a story about Elliot. Elliot is disappointed and returns back to the woods. Grace goes to his father's study to find exact pictures of the dragon Meacham once drew. Although she does not fully believe in the dragon, she starts to open herself to opportunities. In the morning, Grace drives Pete and Natalie to the woods, with a quick stop to pick up Meacham because she thinks he also wants to meet Elliot. They arrive at the forest and Pete leads the way to his cave. Meanwhile, Jack receives a call from the sheriff, telling him that Grace was supposed to deliver Pete to the social services team already waiting for him. Jack deduces Grace is going back to the forest and drives there. Pete introduces Elliot to shocked Natalie, Grace, and Meacham, but just as they are about to embrace Elliot, Gavin and his hunting party show up to catch Elliot, thinking it is a dangerous monster. The event completely destroys Pete and Elliot's treehouse and cave. Knocked unconscious, Elliot is brought to the lumber mill, followed by Jack, Grace, and the kids. They secure Elliot in a large warehouse and forbid anyone curious to look at him from closer. However, Jack already called the sheriff and his cavalry to take care of the dragon. Elliot wakes up for a moment and howls desperately, calling Pete for help. Pete hears Elliot and figures out how to help him. With Natalie's aid, they go out and look for a secret passage to the warehouse where Elliot is kept. Meanwhile, Gavin and Jack hold off the sheriff who wants to see the creature. While the men are arguing outside, Natalie and Pete arrive at the warehouse and lock the door from the inside. They free Elliot's chains, but Elliot is still unable to fly because of the dizziness. The men successfully break into the warehouse only to see nothing. However, Grace knows what is going on. She is the last person to leave the warehouse after she sees Pete and Natalie peeking out from the trailer. She tells Jack that the dragon is still inside, making himself invisible. The kids are about to start the trailer and drive Elliot back into the woods when Meacham steps in and offers to help them drive the trailer. They leave the warehouse, leaving everyone puzzled and scrambling to chase them. Along the road, Jack and Grace, Sheriff and the cavalry, and Gavin and his men all pursue the dragon. Gavin almost catches up to Elliot, but Meacham refuses to pull over. He then blocks the road at the bridge to force Meacham to stop, but the trailer's brake fails so Meacham has no choice but to crash into Gavin's truck after the men run away. Arriving at the other end of the bridge, Elliot finally gathers some courage to fly on top of the bridge and breathes fire to scare off the people who have been bothering him. Unfortunately, Jack and Grace are still trapped inside their car in the middle of the bridge. The bridge cracks and becomes unstable, falling down on several parts. Gavin runs to help save Jack and Grace, but the bridge's damage spreads, causing more parts to fall off including Jack, Grace, and Elliot. Meacham, Pete, and Natalie watch in horror and still hoping for a miracle to happen. Then Elliot comes flying while carrying Grace and Jack on his back. They regroup and embrace each other, but Pete knows Elliot will not be welcomed by the townspeople. He decides to fly off with Elliot, leaving Grace heartbroken. Pete and Elliot come back to their already destroyed treehouse and cave. Elliot is saddened by the fact that even though Pete wants to be with him, he will not be safe anywhere near the town, but Pete needs a better life there. He urges Pete to go back to the town and live with his own people, pointing at an image in Pete's storybook where a family is happily gathered around the campfire. As sad as he is, Pete agrees to Elliot's plan. They fly back to Jack's backyard just as Jack, Grace, and Natalie arrive from the forest. Grace is overjoyed to see Pete again, embracing and kissing him with love. Jack and Natalie are also glad to welcome Pete. They hear Elliot departs, going far away from the town. Sometime later, the town seems normal again, although now everyone believes in dragons so Meacham does not have to tell his dragon stories anymore. Jack and Grace get married and they adopt Pete. During the holiday, they venture to the north so Pete can reunite with Elliot. They also watch other dragons fly nearby. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.